Tonight with Lisa Grant.
Good evening to you if you've just joined us, and welcome back if you've been there before. You're listening to Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. And waiting on the phone for me, I have Jonathan Davis. Good evening.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, how are you doing tonight?
I'm okay, thanks very much. For a change in England, it's not raining.
That is a change, isn't it? It has to be said. I understand you guys are actually having an Indian summer, aren't you? They're referring it to.
Yes, we did have about 3 days where it got above freezing. So, yes, a massive Indian summer, that's for sure. We're not at all envious about you guys in Spain. Not in the slightest.
Not in the slightest. Whole 3 days and everyone's celebrating. Oh, well, hey, as long as it's working. Listen, thank you very much for coming on at short notice again, but I saw this afternoon in the papers, and I just thought, I wonder what Jonathan's got to say about this. The International Monetary Fund can't afford to save the euro. It's got to be a joke, surely. It's got to be a joke.
Well, I think there is a coordinated media avalanche going on right now between governments and banks and what we call the supranational organisations such as the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund in order to frighten the bejeebus of everyone. And I think they're doing exactly the same that happened just 3 years ago in 2008 when Lehman Brothers and AIG went under in the biggest, no doubt, the biggest economic and financial collapse in history.
Absolutely.
The politicians and the media and the banks, as one, said, we have to borrow a vast amount of money and bail out the banks. And I suspect that's exactly what's happening yet again. Now, no doubt the result of the 2008 bailout of the banks was that we created some stability in the system, which meant that for the next couple of years, there wasn't a continuing sharp drop in economies, and unemployment didn't go through the floor in some economies, although it continued to in others, such as Spain and so on.
Sure.
But you know what? They didn't solve any problem. You know, we heard at the time certain people, no names, no pack drill, have saved the world. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Absolutely.
What they did, Lisa, was paper over the cracks, kicking the can down the line yet again, and in the process, they decimated currencies like sterling, which meant that for we in the UK, and indeed your listeners who are receiving their incomes in sterling, our costs of living went through the roof. Because if everything's priced in dollars and our currency went down 25% against the US dollar, it meant that fuel soared, heat and light soared, food, clothing, you name it, practically everything that we import went through the roof. And of course, your listeners out there who, as I say, are receiving their income in sterling, well, we obviously know what happened to the euro against sterling. Euro went through the roof, and it made sterling earners' positions really dire. But now, where are we now? Where are we now? We've got Greece about to leave the euro, defaulting on their debts. And that, of course, is impinging on the euro. So people have seen sterling has strengthened a bit against the euro. What actually is the case, however, is the euro has weakened markedly against the US dollar. That is the main currency cross that people need to be focused on. So the media, the politicians, the banks, they're frightening everyone to death. We have to do more bailouts.
No, I understand.
And I'm saying that's the last thing we need.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we touched on this last week, didn't we? We don't need to do the bailouts. But how can an institution such as the IMF come out and say that they haven't got enough money? I mean, we talked about this off air, didn't we? There's countries all over putting money into the IMF. So
yeah, okay.
Surely they must have more money under their mattress just in case there is a massive crisis financially. You would have thought someone would put a contingency plan in.
Yeah. If you can find anyone in any bureaucratic organisation which plans anything, then I'll eat my hat. The International Monetary Fund is, as you allude, it's an international bank which is basically run from Wall Street. And the American Treasury puts money in, the UK Central, Her Majesty's Treasury puts money in, the Germans and the French and the Chinese, they all put money in, as you say, with the idea that with that money, then they can then loan it to countries in difficulty to tide them over, as it were.
Yeah, I thought that's what the whole idea was.
But the problem is, we're no longer talking about, Lesotho or Namibia or Chile. We're talking about the whole of the Eurozone. We're talking about the euro, the second most widely held currency on the planet. So, why anyone should imagine that one organisation can solve the problem of the Eurozone, the largest trading area in the world, it's cloud cuckoo land to even contemplate it. And yet, that is what the politicians are doing. They are trying to get agreement where ultimately it's going to be Angela Merkel is going to sign off on something which says the German taxpayers, because ultimately they're about the only country in Europe that's got any money, the German taxpayers are going to give money to the IMF and the European Central Bank, and they're going to lend a whole load of money again and stave off bankruptcies of some countries. But that's the operative phrase, Lisa. Stave off.
But also there was a referendum in Germany last month, I think it was, where they were asked, should Germany still do bailouts? And there was a resounding no. The referendum was then regarded as unlawful and illegal by the government, and the parliament basically said to the people of Germany, tough cookie, you're going to have to put up with this. So they're being dictated to where their money is going. They're being dictated to the way they should think. And now you're telling me they're going to have to put their hands in their pockets again. I can't see them being very happy about that.
There's no doubt Angela Merkel is going to be savaged at the next elections. And it's an amazing thing, but Germany, arguably the most powerful nation on earth. I know China is really powerful, but Germany, in my view, it's got more exports than the rest of Europe put together. It's got an amazing balance sheet as a country, and yet the politicians there are so focused on keeping this Euro thing together, keeping the EU together, to heck with the taxpayers of Germany, to heck with what the people want. They will do it because the political and financial elite have said it has to happen. Well, all they're doing yet again is selling the people down the river, and the taxpayers are going to be paying for it literally for decades.
Yeah. Let me read to you from an article. It was in The Independent today. The IMF has warned that it may not be able to rescue bigger European economies struggling with their debt. Meanwhile, the body itself has been accused of being too tough on countries while being too soft on others. Debt-stricken Greece, as we've just touched on, is to redouble its austerity efforts at a time of deep economic recession and to sell a vast chunk of public assets at fire sale prices. It amazes me that things like this can still be written in the papers, that they're being too hard on one country and too soft on another, when quite honestly we're all in a crisis. We've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now. How can things like this be printed? How can they accuse the IMF of that when the IMF is saying, well, actually we haven't got enough money in the bank, so how can they possibly be hard on other countries and soft on others when they've got nothing to work with?
Because the proof is in the pudding. As I say, the International Monetary Fund, it's not really international. It's America. It's largely America. The International Monetary Fund was originally designed to lend to countries in relatively short-term difficulty, and the countries would pay back with interest the money to the International Monetary Fund. But in answer to your question, it's very interesting that when it's the like of Southeast Asian countries which went kaput in the Asian crisis of the late 1990s, the IMF were right in there saying you've got to cut spending, you've got to reduce your public sector, you're going to have to hike taxes, and that was the IMF solution to the Southeast Asian countries' problems. However, you look across the Atlantic to currently the most powerful economy on earth, which has got debts way beyond its eyeballs. It's involved in wars all around the world. Some would say it's got nothing to do with them. It's spending money like there's no tomorrow. And the IMF is literally saying, go on and carry on doing it. Because, as I say, the IMF is Wall Street funded. And this is a very important point. And when these ECB or IMF are talking about bailing out these countries, let me tell you and your listeners, they're not bailing out countries. Greece had a bailout last year. Ireland had a bailout last year. No, they didn't, actually. That's what the press said. That's what the politicians said. No, what it was the banks, the lenders, who had made reckless loans, which they knew would never be repaid because ultimately there was never going to be enough taxpayers to pay the debts. They made those loans knowing full well that governments would then bail out the bankers themselves in due course. And that's what is going on here. The Greeks, they're talking about defaulting on the loans. And the IMF and the ECB will come in and bail out Greece again. No, they won't. They'll be bailing out the French and German and American and British banks which made the reckless loans. And that's the point I want to get across in this conversation, that whenever they talk about bailing out countries, they're not doing it. Listeners, they're bailing out the bankers who made reckless loans. Is it really appropriate that the 99% gets taxed to kingdom come to pay the 1%? I'll leave people to decide that.
Absolutely not. I would say my answer to that, absolutely not. Listen, on that thought, hold on for 2 seconds, Jonathan. We're just going to go to a quick ad break, and we'll continue this in just a couple of minutes.
Tonight with Lisa Grant.
Welcome back, and we're in the middle of our conversation with Jonathan Davis this evening. Jonathan, if I could come back to you, what is the future for the IMF? Quite honestly, would it be better just to disband it and come up with a new plan? Or do you think, you're saying America is so intrinsically involved in it, do you think America would never allow that to happen?
Well, you know, the IMF was essentially created post-World War II, and it's been going on for the last 60 years. But what you need to understand is that in that same time period, demographics in the West have meant that, you know, we had this massive baby boom after the war into about 1960, 1961. So for decades, there were far more people working than retired, and that's the reason why many of your listeners have had opportunities to have had good pensions, big house price growth, that sort of thing. But where are we now? Countries have got massive debts. Households have got massive debts. People who haven't retired have not had an opportunity to build up big pension funds. The IMF, in my view, is an anachronism. It's for another age,
right.
And it was based on an era when there were fewer people taking out of the system and more people putting into the system. Well, the fact is, we're now in an era where there are more people taking out than putting in. Thus, you ask what's going to happen to the IMF. I think, if I may say, that perhaps the question should be what's going to happen to the global economic system. You said a week ago or 2 weeks ago when we spoke that I was pretty terrifying. Well, you ain't seen nothing yet, because as far as I'm concerned, we are in a 20-year depression. When you get 0 or 1% growth year in, year out, if you're lucky, that is not an era where things are going well.
No.
And if the only short-term solution to the problem is to borrow even more money and add it on to the already vast amount of debt, well, I can tell you, we now have problems which are literally insurmountable. We see in the press and the media today that they're trying to build a European financial stability fund of $2 trillion. Sorry, 2 trillion euros, apologies. Where's that money coming from? It'll come from the IMF, it'll come from the ECB, but excuse me, who's going to back that? The answer is you and me, the taxpayers of the West, in order to bail out the banks. And I know this is a tirade against the banks, and frankly, it should be a tirade because they have recklessly lent to households, businesses and governments for years, and now we're at the end of the line.
Yeah.
You can't. There's nothing you can do. You can't reduce interest rates. Well, maybe the European Central Bank could reduce a bit, but not much. There's nothing you can do.
I was just about to say.
Sorry?
What about the European Central Bank? Aren't they supposed to be the ones that are supposed to dictate how Europe is supposed to function as a whole? I don't know. Yeah. It just seems to me that. When it comes to something like the IMF, or it comes to something like the European Central Bank, or it comes to the Bank of England, these are supposed to be respected institutions, and I'll say Wall Street as well. These are meant to be respected institutions. You've heard the term Ponzi scheme. It's named after a guy called Charles Ponzi, who in the 1920s came up with a system whereby if he got people in who gave him some money and they sold other people to put some money in, everyone putting money into a black hole. And the whole global economic system is a Ponzi scheme. It's based on, it's a pyramid of debt. And it starts from an individual household, number 10 Acacia Avenue. And you just think about how much debt an individual house has, an individual household has, multiply that by millions and millions and millions of households, then add to it companies, small and medium-sized businesses, then add to it governments who have borrowed way beyond their tax revenues. The United Kingdom, for example, owes 10 times its annual tax take. Now, if you think of any house which owed 10 times its income, well, you just know the whole system is bust. Absolutely.
And these guys, they've been so-called managing an explosion in debt for particularly the last 20 years. And although the baby boomers have benefited from it greatly with their house prices, with their pensions, I'm sorry, we're now at the end of the line and people need to get real.
Absolutely.
We are in depression. There's only one direction for this, and I'm telling you, it is not pretty. People need to get real. They need to sort out their own finances as quickly as possible.
Jonathan, if I could just stop you there for a minute. We've had an email in from one of our listeners, Bertha. She says, "Hi, Lisa, can you please ask Jonathan if he feels that this deliberate financial meltdown," and she's got that in inverted commas, deliberate financial meltdown, is a move to bring around a new world government?
I wouldn't go that far because that means it brings in the Chinese, for example, and I doubt very much the Chinese would want to get involved with that. They're far too independent-minded. I certainly do believe that it's a push for a European government. Although Brussels in theory is the European, it isn't really. It's the European commissioners that run the show, not unelected commissioners. So yes, I do think that they're trying to push for closer integration, which basically means that, for example, Madrid will become like Birmingham Town Hall to the London equivalent of Brussels. Brussels will become the capital of Europe. They're trying to get the United States of Europe, and they're trying to scare everyone into accepting or believing that that's the only future. Well, it's a future, but it's not necessarily the only future.
Well, Jonathan, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I really do appreciate it. Just one last question before you go. What would you replace the IMF with?
Well, I see the IMF as being part of the problem. And in the same vein, we've got central banks like the Federal Reserve of the US. We've got the European Central Bank with the Bank of England. I would actually get rid of central banks. As far as I'm concerned, they have been criminally negligent in allowing the banks to take so much control over ordinary people's lives. And I go back to the statement, when they're talking about bailing out countries, they're not bailing out countries, they're bailing out the lenders. So I would just get rid of these institutions. They're bureaucracies designed to be self-supporting and replicating. They don't actually help the ordinary people. I think you should bring control of finance to as small a level as possible, and certainly to national governments. And the main problem actually is not even with IMF. The main problem is that with most democracies, you can't change a government. I mean, just in one, very, very quickly, look at the United Kingdom. Most seats are safe seats. So even though they say, look, if you don't like us, you can get rid of us, you can't get rid of them. Yeah. And that's why in Germany, for example, 60% of the people don't like the bailouts, but there's not a lot they can do about it, because in reality, we don't have true democracy, even though it's one person, one vote.
Yeah.
That's, the main problem.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. A pleasure as ever. And thank you very much for...
Things to think about.
Yeah, loads to think about, and I'm sure this is going to be rumbling on for a long time.